Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Pepe Jijon Tyoxidator Wash Processed Ecuador from Manhattan Coffee Roasters. And there's a peg right there. And Manhattan, based out of Rotterdam, Netherlands. And this coffee was featured in our most recent blind taste test rankings video, where it finished 3rd place out of 4 Pepe Jijon coffees on that day. And if you watched that video, then you saw that the main reason for this coffee's placement was because the 1st and 2nd place finisher came out as super clean floral cups of coffee, which tends to be my preference in coffee in general. However, with that being said, I went into this review with some extremely high expectations, as there had been a fair bit of buzz around this coffee, and I'd really enjoyed the typica mejorada variety up to this point this year, so it was going to be very interesting to see if this coffee lived up to some pretty high expectations. This right here is day 31. And the recipe we went with for this coffee was a little different for Manhattan, a 16:1 water to coffee ratio brewed at 204 degrees Fahrenheit, and I like this one best through the Chemex, which indicates a more medium grind. Manhattan is a European light for the roast profile. With those things out of the way, let's go and start discussing this coffee. Day 8, first impression, and the cup was not what I had expected at all, as it came out super herbal floral on that first impression. There is a hibiscus flavor note listed on here, and it made a lot of sense as it was so overpowering and overbearing that I wasn't able to get too much else from this coffee on that first impression, and I made a decision to let the coffee sit a little longer than I would for most Manhattan coffees, as typically I feel comfortable starting them pretty early, but I felt like this one maybe needed just a little bit of rest. Day 16. After letting the coffee sit for a bit, it still had the same sort of aspects that I experienced from my first time trying this coffee, as it continued to feel a lot more herbal than I was expecting. It is still clean, there's a slight bit of sweetness, and at this time I was able to get a little bit more, some slight citric aspect to this cup of coffee as well, but still by no means the expectations I had for it going into it. Day 17 ran it through the Chemex, and for the first time I was starting to see the coffee trending in a more positive direction, as a lot of these strong herbal floral components were toned down and a little bit of the sweetness was accentuated. Sugary sweetness in the cup, seemingly reminiscent of some slight orange juice, as well as some interesting candy components. So it was better, and I was seeing the coffee trending in some right direction. Day 19 ran it through the V60 with some slightly lower temperatures, and it was at this moment I decided that the Chemex was just more ideal for me for this coffee, as the Chemex really seemed to tone down so much of that herbality and really seemed to ramp up a lot more of the sweetness that I was experiencing from it, as even with some lower temperatures and some slightly less herbal components to this cup of coffee, it still was by no means the same sort of experience I had had from the Chemex. So day 22, when I attempted the same traditional recipe we have for Manhattan with the Chemex, I continued to see more positive results. However, it still does accentuate a lot of the herbal components that are coming from this coffee when brewed at those higher temperatures from my experience. So I decided that, you know what, I'm starting to see positives from lower temperatures, I'm starting to see positives from the Chemex, so why don't we combine the two? And on day 25, we finally did back through the Chemex, lower temperatures, and this coffee just radiated unbridled candy sweetness. The sweetness absolutely skyrocketed, and I want to say up to this point, the highest I could have probably put the sweetness was about a level 3. But with these adjustments, I could say that this on a relative tasting wheel would jump all the way up to that level 6 mark, as this coffee just radiated so much sweetness. It was so heightened and so focused that the best way I could describe the just insane sweetness coming from this cup of coffee was if you would put a bunch of sugar inside of a soda, and you you've drank the soda, and at the bottom of the soda can you had a bunch of sugar that's just been marinating in soda. That's basically what this coffee tasted like, as the sweetness just absolutely shot up in abundance. Day 28, one more day through the Chemex with the exact same recipe, and I will touch on some other aspects because there is an herbality, and that's why I will say that it still had that soda-like aspect to it, because the herbality and soda typically go hand in hand, especially when pertaining to coffee. So that's where I was getting this kind of soda sweetness, but it was still that strong sugariness that was present throughout the time. After the coffee has cooled down ever so slightly, it just opens up in wild abundance. There's a little bit of this orange factor to the cup of coffee as well, but given just how strong and dominant the sugariness is in this cup of coffee, these were definitely secondary and tertiary components to a pretty distinct flavor that was coming from this coffee. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And 2 level 5s, let's run through those real quick. So the caramel at level 5, and I want to emphasize and focus that this is by no means a caramel sweetness. However, this is kind of the best spot I can put the sugary sweetness that was coming from this cup of coffee, because it was this really strong artificial sugar sweetness that could only really fit into that category, but it was in so much abundance that I had to put something at level 5 in addition to the sweetness, and that's just kind of the best fit for it. But I wouldn't say it was like a caramelly cup of coffee. It's just, think of that caramel as really strong candied sugar. And then the sweetness at a level 5, I think this might be the sweetest Manhattan coffee I've ever had, and it is probably the second sweetest coffee I might have ever had in general, as the Eugenioides coffees. They are like a level 7, but this is still really strong and up there at what I would say is a relative level 6 mark. Super sweet, unbelievably sweet, and I think it's definitely justified at the very least at that level 5 mark. Cleanliness, level 4. It's not going to be the cleanest cup of coffee out there, however, it still has a really nice cleanliness to it, so having that all the way up to our level 4 mark, in addition to that level 5 sweetness, is a huge selling point to me. Finish, level 4. Even with all of those things I've said, it is by no means an overbearing coffee or an overbearing sweetness. It is really strong on the sweetness, but it still finishes off, for the most part, pretty moderate, enough to the point where it does not push all the way up to a level 5. Acidity, yes, and it's a slightly citric acidity that I'm getting from the coffee, and we've hardly discussed the citrus in this coffee because, as mentioned, it's mostly a tertiary component to it. So let's discuss that real quick, as we do have the citrus fruit at a level 3, and I believe they have a clementine flavor note listed on here. And yeah, I could definitely see that. It's definitely there. It's been present throughout the time drinking this coffee, but at no point would I say that this was the most dominant aspect. Even on the earlier days, a more secondary aspect, and towards the end, a more tertiary aspect. Florality, level 3, yeah, that's the second most pronounced component to it, but it's diluted by this really strong sugariness coming from this coffee. So while both of those could be higher, the florality especially would have been level 4, maybe even level 5 on the earlier days. By the end, given just how much sugar I was able to get from it, had to keep the tasting wheel pretty relative and how the florality and citrus compared to the sweetness in this coffee. Body, moderate, level 3, has a fair bit of body, nice body. Savoriness at a level 2. As mentioned, earlier days were probably skyrocketing that as well, given the herbality was super strong from those first couple of impressions, but toning that all the way down to a level 2 from the adjustments we made definitely feels justified. So by the end, I really like the way this tasting wheel looks from the way I was able to get this coffee to act in accordance of what my expectations actually were. Alright, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. I am very fortunate that as of this moment, I do not need to make a determination as to whether this was my favorite coffee of the year, but given that we have another Pepe Jijon coffee that's coming up that I'm going to be reviewing here shortly, I can safely say that this was either my favorite or my second favorite of those two coffees, and I can hold off until the end of the year to make that distinction. And I can also say that this was easily one of my favorite coffees of the entire year. It's challenging that passenger washed Panamanian Geisha as my favorite coffee, in addition to that other Pepe Jijon from Café Circular. This is a wonderful cup of coffee, and I've heard some mixed feedback, and I think it's because a lot of people haven't been able to get the best from this coffee. I can say that it did take me a little bit. It took me a lot of adjustments to get there, but once I got there, it was so unique, different, and wonderful. It had all of the aspects I really like, maybe minus some florality and some fruit sweetness, but given the unique sweetness, I always say, serve me a unique cup of coffee that's super sweet and clean, and I will just lose my mind over it. And that's essentially what happened with this coffee. This is a spectacular one of my favorite Manhattan coffees of all time, and one of my favorite coffees I've ever reviewed on this channel. I cannot rave enough about the experience that I was able to get from this coffee. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to. This is extremely tricky because, as mentioned, I know a lot of people have been struggling with this coffee, but if you can get the adjustments right, so if you have the patience to work through a bag and really experiment through it, then I think by the end you can get it, especially if you're looking for some wonderful sweetness, because I cannot emphasize enough just how much sweetness there was in this cup of coffee, and it is delightful. It is absolutely lovely. You need to enjoy your sweeter coffees in general because this had it in so much abundance, and it makes for such a fun and unique experience, especially for coffees, because this one right here is another one of those coffees that I say we're pushing the expectations of coffee. This one's going further than what we've experienced from coffees before, and that's a wonderful thing. That'll always make me really happy. Such a unique, impressive coffee in general. I think for the most part, I'll leave this review at that. If you've by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I would love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. And this right here has been a review of the Pepe Jijon Tyoxidator wash processed Ecuador from Manhattan Coffee Roasters. Thank you for watching.